in a sense, Dawkins' book probably should have been called Climbing Mount Probable. In a sense, it's the mountain that makes it probable to get to the top, but that mountain itself is highly improbable.
ID, the Future, a podcast about evolution and intelligent design.
Welcome to ID the Future. I'm your host, Andrew McDiarmid. Today, my in-depth conversation with Dr. William Dembski about his new monograph, Unpacking the Law of the Conservation of Information. And if you don't know much about this concept yet, you're going to want to stick around and get as much of it as you can today, and I'll point you to how you can read his monograph for free. Now, for starters, if you don't know Dr. Dembski yet, let me give you a few details. He's the founding and senior fellow with Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture, as well as a distinguished fellow with the Institute's Walter Bradley Center for Natural and Artificial Intelligence. He's a graduate of the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he earned a bachelor's in psychology and a doctorate in philosophy. He also received a doctorate in mathematics from the University of Chicago in 1988 and a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary in 1996. He has held National Science Foundation graduate and postdoctoral fellowships. Dr. Dembski has published in the peer-reviewed mathematics, engineering, biology, philosophy, and theology literature. He's the author or editor of more than 25 books, most recently a brand new edition of The Design Inference, his classic work, updated completely in a new revised edition co-authored with Winston Ewart. Now, in our first episode, we established the foundations of what Dembski calls nature's missing law, the law of conservation of information. We explored the historical roots of this concept, going back to thinkers and scientists in the 19th and 20th centuries who applied the idea in physics and computer science. We also learned that this law acts as a rigorous accounting tool for search processes, proving that information cannot materialize out of nothing, but is instead redistributed or shuffled from pre-existing sources. Now today, we shift from the theoretical to the practical, looking at how the law applies to the study of biological origins and the theory of intelligent design. We'll explore the displacement fallacy and how famous evolutionary simulations like Richard Dawkins's Methinks Like a Weasel or the Avida program surreptitiously smuggle in the very information they claim to create from scratch. We'll also examine the staggering rarity of functional biological targets, such as functional protein folds, and why this rarity implies a fundamental lack of evolvability that purely material mechanisms cannot overcome. All this will lead us to the ultimate conclusion of Dembski's work on the law of conservation of information, the existence of an irreducible intelligence capable of creative innovation that transcends the limits of mindless algorithms. All right, let's get started. Well, Dr. Dembski, thanks again for joining us.
Good to be with you, Andrew.
Okay, so just as a person uses Google or their preferred search engine to find a specific website in the vastness of the internet, neo-Darwinism suggests that nature must search for functional biological structures within a near infinite space of non-functional possibilities. But some biologists, like H. Alan Orr, argue in response to your work on the no free lunch theorems that evolution has no preset target and thus isn't a search. You contend that if evolution isn't a targeted search, can't really regard it as science. Can you explain the problem there?
Yeah, I think some biologists, I wouldn't say all, you've got somebody like Stuart Kauffman, for instance, who's totally comfortable with the idea of evolutionary search or the term evolutionary search. It's widely used, or I think, and others see search as inherently teleological. And so there has to be some sort of preset target set out by a purposive intelligence. And so what they want to say is because there's no purpose really in biology, there's no purpose giver behind it, this very terminology is illegitimate. But I would say it isn't, and the reason is that there are still fundamental biological functionalities, things that you need to be alive, things that if which you don't have, you're dead, that are just basic to biology. And so biology has to be able to get to them. Insofar as biological evolution is a complexity increasing process, those increases in complexity have to be accounted for. They form targets as well, if you will. So, biologists, I think, could get more comfortable with this idea if they just adopted a view of these being natural kinds, or just being there are features in the biological world that are required for biology to do anything interesting at all, for biology to be biology. So I think it's really more of a terminological quibble with or. How do you get the first life? How do you get something that has a genetic code, that has a machinery that produces proteins from genes? How do you get a bacterial flagellum? How do you get various functional tissues or things? It seems to me it's legitimate to refer to those as targets, and that they can be referred to as targets without importing a whole teleology, and that we can let the teleology be decided later based on the sort of science that we do and the inferences we draw. Anyway, I don't want to get defensive or get too much into it, but it seems to me that the language of evolutionary search is entirely legitimate. And on the flip side, if you don't have something like search, what is evolution doing? I mean, if it's, what you didn't quote from that Ellen Orr article is where he says that evolution is pure cold demographics. It's just gene frequencies. Well, gene frequencies aren't going to explain how you get these complex biological structures. Genes can fluctuate any number of ways. So there's a lot that his approach to biology leaves unexplained. So you're going to need something. Let me just put it this way: if it's not targeted search, what is it? Give me a model that will account for the sorts of complexities we're looking at. And he's not offering that. So, and I would say a lot of biologists are comfortable with this idea of search. I mean, even Daniel Dennett, who is as hardcore a naturalist as you could find, would refer to evolutionary search.
Yeah. Now, you've analyzed computer simulations like Richard Dawkins's Weasel and the Avita simulation. How do these programs tend to smuggle in information when they claim to create it from scratch?
Yeah, I don't know if Dawkins would claim to create it from scratch, but I think the people who were behind Avita did, because they specifically had their eyes on intelligent design. What they're claiming is that they're getting some result that, is supposed to be remarkable, that would be unexpected. But here it is, So, I mean, Dawkins is the simplest one out there. He has a phrase, I think it's 28 characters. He thinks it is like a weasel. If you include spaces as characters, it's a phrase from Shakespeare's Hamlet. And, if you've got 28 characters, 27 possibilities, it's 27 to the 28. I think that's about the 10 to the 40 possibilities. And, so getting that sequence among a sea of, 10 to the 40, I mean, that's 10,000 billion. That's a lot. I mean, that's probably, the number of grains of sand in the world multiplied by itself. I mean, it's a lot. So how do you find that one grain of sand? Well, he says, you can't do it just by chance, but if you imagine, you just take a random sequence of 28 characters, and then you start varying them randomly, and then rewarding those that are point for point closer to this target sequence. He doesn't call it necessarily target sequence, but he thinks it is like a weasel. Then you can, in short order, evolve to that sequence. Now, computationally, all he's got is a hill climbing algorithm with, straight up slope, no local minima or maxima anywhere. And, it evolves. I think in his simulation, he got there in about 40 to 50 steps. So he got there, but the question is, what did he actually show? Well, I mean, he had the target sequence built into the program, and then had these comparisons between a sequence uh, that's currently in place and the target sequence. And then they get varied randomly, and then they just naturally get closer and closer until they finally hit that target sequence. So all the information was built in. I mean, you could just see it. Now, I think what you have with, in this case, if you will, if it's like a, game of P, hide the P, or move it, it was pretty easy to spot where that P was, and, and as he's trying to move it, where it is. Now, you can add more shells to cover the P, in the shell game, and start moving things more quickly. And I think that's what happens with these more sophisticated programs. So Avida was trying to, was published in 2003, I believe, in Nature. And the idea was to evolve Boolean functions of increasing complexity. And so they were able to evolve Boolean functions of increasing complexity. But one reason they were able to do it is because they rewarded increasingly complex Boolean functions. That was explicit in the program. So it wasn't really a big surprise. And so it was baked into this program. And over again with these evolutionary computing scenarios, which were supposed to be used to show that evolution has all this power. In fact, it wasn't doing anything like what evolution is supposed to be doing, which is not having all the information built in. I mean, Richard Dawkins, one of his claims is that what makes evolution such a great theory is that you can get all this complexity from, as he calls it, primordial simplicity, so you can move up in complexity. And these complex Boolean functions, it was baked into it. So no surprise really. And you could spot where the information was put in. Now in biology, it becomes much more difficult because life is so much more complicated. We can't look under the hood to see what the computer code was as we can here, in terms of how things have evolved. So it's, so I think often what the evolutionist can do is simply throw up his or her hands and say, prove me wrong, show that it didn't happen by some blind evolutionary process. And so then the challenge becomes more to find systems that resist these Darwinian explanations, where we can do the necessary sorts of calculations and show that, that indeed they aren't unevolvable by Darwinian means. So I think Doug Axe's work is particularly important in that regard. But that's the, I think it's important to keep in mind that, for the Darwinist, the straight up materialistic, naturalistic biologist, no aspect of biology can be designed. Everything needs to be explained by some sort of naturalistic story. So the burden on the design theorists is not to show that every aspect of biology is designed. There can be aspects of biology, a genome that's been randomly hit by some gamma rays, and then some sort of mutation takes place and it's preserved and transmitted. Okay, that was the result of chance. But how did you get that genome in the first place? It's so the challenge with for the design theorists is not to show that every aspect of biology is designed, but that some aspect is designed. That's the negation. Okay, if for all X such and such is the case, then it's the negation is it's not the case that for all X, which is equivalent to, is there exists something for which it's not the case. There exists something that is, so there's something that is designed, that's enough. And if there was just one clear example of design in biology that couldn't be ascribed to human or, embodied intelligence, that would be enough to settle the matter. So that's the sort of, what we're facing, sort of thing. And then then we have to look at these questions of evolvability and the information that goes into them and the sorts of naturalistic processes that are supposed to be involved, and then see if there are some real barriers to these evolutionary processes. And again, it takes more of a negative line. We talked in the previous program about proscriptive generalization, saying that certain things can't happen. You can't build a perpetual motion machine because of second law of thermodynamics. And so can we show that there's certain types of evolutionary transitions that can't happen, or they're very unlikely to happen? And if they still must have happened, well, that becomes evidence against a certain theory of evolution. But I mean, the way I think things tend to be done these days by the naturalists is that the deck is stacked in their favor. If they can show that some evolutionary transition could happen easily, and there are examples of this, because you may have some knockout experiment and then, it just requires one or two mutations to recover, the gene for a function. Then it can happen by chance, and presto, changeo, you're back with that function. But it's how do you get that function in the first place? How, those are the sorts of questions that the design theorists look at. But I think often we're seen as, being this wet blanket, showing what couldn't happen. Well, I think part of the reason we're a wet blanket is because we have these completely credulous evolutionists who believe that Darwinian evolution can do anything, and have no appreciation for its limitations.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Dawkins, he uses the metaphor of climbing Mount Improbable to show how small steps lead to complexity. So why does the law of conservation of information suggest that the topography itself, the path, heading up to Dawkins's Mount Improbable, is what actually requires an information source?
Yeah. Well, I mean, he needs Mount Improbable to be scalable by these baby steps, because, I mean, the Darwinian form of evolution is a very gradualistic form of evolution. You don't get hopeful monsters. You can't have things just magically materializing, without any sort of precedent. But yeah, I mean, in terms of conservation of information, I mean, just to review, I mean, the basic idea is that when you have some highly improbable event, if you're going to explain how it happened, in terms of something else, you need to increase the probability of that event, because it's high improbability, just doesn't, it's unaccountable. Just getting lucky is not going to be a good scientific explanation. So you have to have some mechanism, something that allows that probability to increase, which is it's called a probability amplifier. So the probability of that event given the amplifier now suddenly goes up. But there's a fundamental probabilistic inequality which says if you got a probability of an event, it's going to be greater than or equal to the probability of an event given that amplifier times the probability of the amplifier. And so if the probability of the event given the amplifier goes up, the probability of the amplifier has to go down. It's like, I don't know, if you've got a number 0.01, and it's greater than or equal to 1 million, times something. Well, that times something is going to be way less than 0.01. It's going to be, it's got to be 1 in a billion or something like that. But the thing is, probabilities are always numbers between 0 and 1. So it couldn't be a million, and just making a point. I mean, this is how inequalities work. If you got something that's greater than or equal to something else and it's a product, both things can't be too big, and if one thing is big, then the other thing is going to need to be small so you can maintain the inequality. And that's what we're dealing with conservation of information. So to Dawkins' example of climbing Mount Improbable, if you've got a mountain that's scalable in this way, where you can increase the probabilities according to conservation of information, they're going to be, and if it's highly improbable to get to the top of that mountain without, some, just directly, if you will, then when you consider all possible mountains that take you up to the top, most of them are not going to have those gradual paths. Most of them will not make things highly probable. Most of them will be sheer. Most of them will have paths that go up some way, but then you can't bridge it. But and, that actually it makes good sense. And that's what conservation of information is telling you. Now, Dawkins might say, but there has to be Mount Improbable has to be scalable, because we're here and evolution was so successful. Okay, but how did you get Mount Improbable in the first place? Okay, pushes the problem further back, and you might say, well, the environment then had to be specially tuned for that. Okay, but where did that tuning come from? That itself needs explanation. That itself is highly improbable. So it's that's the point that's always unappreciated. And we talked about that in the last program also, this sense of filling one hole by digging another. And often you're just not aware that you are digging another. It seems like you're actually explaining something, but you're not. This idea, so he's getting up here. Okay, we've got a Mount Improbable that makes it actually probable. Okay, but Mount Probable, if you will, that gets you, that overcomes that improbability is itself highly improbable. In a sense, Dawkins' book probably should have been called Climbing Mount Probable. In a sense, it's the mountain that makes it probable to get to the top, but that mountain itself is highly improbable. There are lots of ways of having mountains, and why do you have a special mountain that made it probable?
That was Dr. William Dembski explaining how the law of conservation of information can be applied to a critique of Darwinian evolutionary proposals. Now, I hope you're starting to get a good grasp on this concept of the conservation of information and how it applies to theories of the origin of life and of the universe. Now, don't miss the conclusion to this conversation in a separate Part 4 episode where Dr. Dembski and I will discuss the ultimate origin of information, something he calls irreducible intelligence. And remember, you can learn more about all of this with a free download of Dr. Dembski's monograph. Check out the show notes for this episode for a link to that. It's at the Biocomplexity website. That's a journal, a scientific journal, that is peer-reviewed, and that's where you're going to find Dr. Dembski's monograph. But the link is in the show notes. Well, for ID the Future, I am Andrew McDiarmid. Thanks again for tuning in.
Visit us at idthefuture.com and intelligentdesign.org. This program is copyright Discovery Institute and recorded by its Center for Science and Culture.